pictures of those labels for Wal-Mart. Scott Nova is with us right now, back from yesterday, now in Washington with the Worker Rights Consortium. Scott, can you put this into a larger context and also talk about the danger that Kalpona Akter faces as she takes on the dangers of the garment industry in Bangladesh?
Well, the central concern is that Bangladesh is now the second largest producer of apparel in the world, and it got to that position by giving... After China, by giving retailers like Walmart exactly what they want, which is the cheapest labor costs in the world. And they achieve those low labor costs by paying minimum wages of 18 to 20 cents an hour and by completely ignoring fundamental worker safety protections. As a result, you have a massive industry with more than 3 million workers that is defined by sub-poverty wages and extreme dangers for workers inside the workplace. The fundamental change that is necessary here is for buyers like Walmart to be willing to pay a price to the factories for the clothing sufficient to make it possible for the factories to produce in a safe and responsible manner. And yet Walmart and the others refuse to increase the prices they pay to the factories to make it possible for them to operate safely.
What is your response to what Walmart has said, that they have cut ties with this factory, that they didn't realize they were using it? What is their history with the Tazreen factory in Dhaka, the capital of Bangladesh?
There's an enormous contradiction here, because Walmart is a company whose foundational corporate principle is cost reduction through absolute control over supply chain logistics and production information. And yet now they want us to believe that they have so little control over their supply chain that they have no idea which factories are actually making their clothing. To say the least, it strains credulity. The bottom line is that Walmart goods, as they've now admitted, were being produced in this factory, and Walmart is responsible for protecting the rights and the safety of the workers who make its clothing.
And Kalpona Akter, why do you face criminal charges?
We are facing criminal charges. Me and my colleagues facing criminal charges because we are raising the voice for better wage for our workers. Because our workers in Bangladesh who are making clothes for Western brands, they are getting $37 as a minimum wage per month, which is not enough for their half-month cost even. So we are supporting workers' voice to having a decent living wage for them, and this is one of the reasons that why we are facing all these criminal charges.
I wanted to ask you about the death of your colleague, Aminul Islam, a Bangladeshi labor activist like yourself, who helped expose working conditions in the garment industry. His body found in April showed signs of torture. 2 years before this, he'd also been arrested and tortured by police and intelligence services for protesting low wages. Can you talk about the work he did and the retaliation that organizers face like yourself?
Aminul Islam was... I'm really proud to be working with him. He was an incredible great organizer who was, he was working at the Savar industrial belt, which is most of factory located in the Dhaka periphery, and he was in a frontliner organizer in the field who was organizing workers to raise their voices, join with union, and also supported their voice to have a decent living wage for them, and decent wage for them to survive. So Aminul became the enemy of this industry, or the security intelligence when he was supporting workers' voices, when he was supporting or helping with their grievances. So this is the one way that they targeted Aminul, and finally they killed him.
I wanted to ask you about a piece in the Times, the New York Times today, that quotes Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina of Bangladesh offering prayers and sympathy for the dead, at the same time voicing suspicions that the fires were arsons intended to undermine the country's garment industry without presenting any evidence of a broader conspiracy, the New York Times wrote. She called for vigilance against sabotage. She called in Parliament to detain those who are carrying out subversive activities and take necessary actions against the culprits. Are you concerned about what message is being sent? What do you think the Bangladeshi Prime Minister is doing right now?
It is, it is our bad luck that after this massive death and this accident, we are hearing and these messages from our Prime Minister when she is saying that it is a sabotage, and rather saying that the safety standards wasn't enough in that factory. Now, all this political group giving a political color of this accident. Okay. We are really concerned that how they are diverting this issue, rather putting a focus on that the factory is really, the garment factory is really in a vulnerable condition in terms of fire safety, in terms of safe working place. So I think the issue is being diverting, saying that it was a sabotage, it was arson, it is a conspiracy. I don't believe there was any conspiracy on this.
I want to get both of your response to a comment by Fox Business host Charles Payne. Speaking Monday, he said the fire at the Bangladesh factory was a rare event and the people who died in the tragedy were thankful for their jobs.
Listen, it's one of these things. I don't think something like this will happen again. Don't think that the people in Bangladesh who perished didn't want or need those jobs as well. I know we like to victimize everyone in this country, particularly when it comes to the for-profit motivation, which is being assaulted.
Your response. Let us begin in Washington, D.C. with Scott Nova.
It's an extreme version of what is, unfortunately, a view that is held relatively widely, and that is because Bangladesh is a poor country with high unemployment, that these workers should be happy with whatever jobs and whatever wages and whatever conditions they get from Western brands and retailers because it's better than nothing. But the reality is any worker who works making clothing for a brand like Wal-Mart or retailer like Gap and through that work is contributing profits to those companies has a right to be paid a decent wage and, most importantly, has a right to work in a workplace where they don't take their life into their hands every day when they come to work. So it's an absurd point of view.
Here in this country, Scott Nova, how are you organizing?
Well, we are working with a range of organizations around the country, including with universities who have licensing deals with important sports apparel companies to pressure those brands and retailers to behave responsibly in terms of the way they operate their global supply chains. One brand, PVH, which owns Calvin Klein and Tommy Hilfiger, did agree after a fire in 2010 to make a series of binding fire safety commitments in an agreement with Bangladeshi and international unions and labor rights organizations. And that agreement, if implemented, will begin to make real change and protect lives in Bangladesh. Unfortunately, the key players in Bangladesh, like Gap and Wal-Mart, have failed to join that agreement and continue to refuse to take meaningful action to protect the lives, to protect the safety of the workers who make their clothing.
I want to play a comment from one of the protest leaders who demanded those responsible for the disaster be held accountable and pay compensation to the victims. This is Shireen Akhtar.
What I want to say is that there should be immediate compensation for the families who lost their relatives, and they must take responsibility for the living and the education of their children, and also for the treatment of those who were injured and those who have become disabled through the accident.
Kalpona Akter, your response to Shireen Akhtar.
That was Nazma Akhtar, that was not Shireen Akhtar. So what she was saying that definitely we want compensation for our workers, and the compensation should not be that so-called what the Bangladeshi government and factory owners saying that it is 100,000 taka or 200,000 taka. We want a compensation which should be considered as a fatal accident, which means that the compensation should be counted as how many years our workers could work if they alive. So this is one. And second, if I wanted to comment on what Scott was saying, that yes, we need this job. We have a huge unemployment. We need this job, but it is really time to say and let the world know that we need this job with dignity. We need this job with a safe working place. Our workers working here and working for the Western brands, but did not give any license to anyone to kill them like they have been killed in fashion.
This factory fire in Bangladesh recalls a similar tragedy more than 100 years ago here in the United States at the Triangle Shirtwaist factory fire, not far from our studios here in New York City. It was the deadliest workplace accident in New York City's history and a seminal moment for American labor. On March 25, 1911, nearly 150 garment workers, mostly young immigrant women, Jewish and Italian, died after a fire broke out at the Triangle factory. Only a year before, workers had protested for shorter hours, better pay, safer worker conditions, and the right to unionize. The fire began when a lit cigarette or match ignited a fire on the 8th floor of the factory building. Flames quickly trapped the women in a deadly inferno. This is an excerpt of a radio piece that I did about the fire in 1986, along with journalist Kathy Dobie.
I worked right near where the fire was. There was cutters there. They were cutting the material. And as soon as they were just going out, it was time to go home. It was 4 o'clock on Saturday.
Pauline Pepe is a 94-year-old survivor of the Triangle fire.
I saw the fire in the tables where they were all filled with lingerie material, you know, and that come up in a flame. When I saw that, I ran out. I went to the door that was closed. I didn't know that was closed. I went there and I found the door closed. I just stood there till they opened it. 40 people going down the steps. We all tumbled one right after another. And I saw people throwing themselves from the window. And as soon as we went down, we couldn't get out because the bodies were coming down. It was terrible.
The women that died that late afternoon were young Jewish and Italian immigrants. When the fire broke out, they tried to escape down the stairs, but found the doors had been locked. The owners believed that given the chance, workers would sneak out with stolen material, and union organizers would sneak in. Some of the women climbed onto the single fire escape. It collapsed. As onlookers watched, women fell 9 stories to the sidewalk below. Inside the factory, the fire spread quickly, and with no exit left to them, the women climbed through the windows and leapt to their death.
That, an excerpt from our documentary on the Triangle Shirtwaist factory fire. Special thanks to Kathy Dobie. Pauline Pepe was one of the oldest survivors of that fire. Scott Nova, you certainly know this history. On the eve of Thanksgiving, I went and visited the Triangle factory once again just above Washington Square in New York. It has a plaque. The significance of what this meant in U.S. labor history, even launching Francis Perkins, who became the Secretary of Labor under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and similarities you see to Bangladesh.
Well, the Triangle Fire, of course, galvanized a social reform movement that ultimately transformed the U.S. apparel industry from a sweatshop industry to one defined by middle-class wages and safe workplaces. Unfortunately, the response of the U.S. apparel industry to those improvements was to leave the United States and relocate production to countries like Bangladesh, where they could reinstitute this model of ultra-low-cost production achieved through sub-poverty wages, lax regulation, lack of basic respect for worker rights and worker safety. And so we see now, more than 100 years after the Triangle Fire, a replication of the results of those brutal conditions, and the parallels are startling. At the Triangle Fire, time of the Triangle Fire, as in this factory, Tazreen, workers were working on a Saturday, working through the weekend. The fire started likely as a result, in the Tazreen case, of an electrical short. You heard the reasons for the fire at Triangle. In both cases, a complete lack of adequate fire safety provisions, inadequate fire exits for workers. The result is people were trapped in both cases in the building, and more than 100 in each case died. And so it really is an extraordinary achievement in an ironic sense that the U.S. apparel industry has managed to replicate early 20th century conditions that were so brutal and cruel to workers, now again here in 2012 in factories in places like Bangladesh. It's a shameful record for the U.S. apparel industry, a shameful record for companies like Wal-Mart and Gap, and hopefully this horror will finally galvanize a global push for genuine reform of the labor practices of the big apparel brands and retailers.
Scott Nova, in terms of Gap and Walmart, what have been their responses? We invited Walmart on the broadcast today. They and while we have their statements, they haven't come on, and we hope that they will someday soon. But talk about their history? I mean, particularly, for example, with Tasmin saying now they've just cut off the subcontractor. They didn't realize that that factory was still being used.
Right. Well, one of the purposes of this system of global outsourcing is to enable companies like Walmart to distance themselves from responsibility for the wages and working conditions of the workers who make their clothing. And, of course, that's what we see them now trying to do in this case, distance themselves from responsibility that they clearly bear. You know, both Walmart and Gap, who are two of the biggest players in Bangladesh, have been urged for years to put in place meaningful fire safety protections in their supply chain. After a similar fire in late 2010 that killed 30 workers in a factory producing primarily for Gap, Gap made a public pledge that they would institute a meaningful fire safety program. And through months of negotiations between ourselves and a range of other labor rights organizations, we tried to get Gap to make simple, basic commitments to put in place protections for their workers in Bangladesh, and yet they've refused to take those steps, pulled out of the negotiations, and continue to be unwilling to do the things that are necessary to protect workers, which include independent fire safety inspections in these factories, ensuring that there are adequate fire safety systems, compelling suppliers that don't have them to put them in place, a commitment to stop doing business with suppliers that refuse to operate in a safe manner. Of particular importance, a commitment to pay a price to suppliers that makes it possible for them to operate in a safe and responsible manner and still survive as a business. These are the steps that Gap and Walmart and the other big players in Bangladesh need to take, and the steps they continue to refuse to take, even in the wake of fires like this.
Secretary of State Hillary Clinton spoke earlier this year in Dhaka, in Bangladesh, the same city where the factory fires took place this weekend. She was asked about the repression workers face there when trying to organize to improve their conditions. This was Hillary Clinton's response.
You know, the history of labor rights and labor unions in any developing society is always difficult. There are strong forces that oppose workers being organized. We had this in my own country. You go back to the 19th and the early 20th century, when labor unions were just getting started, there were goons, there were thugs, there were killings, there were riots, there were terrible conditions. We passed laws at the beginning of the 20th century against child labor, against, you know, too many hours for people to work. But that took time. It took time to develop a sense of political will to address those issues. So you are beginning that, and it's a very important struggle. Do not be discouraged or intimidated, but you deserve to have the support of your government and your society.
Nova, I'd like to get your response first as an American citizen. Hillary Clinton speaking in Dhaka at the International School, Dhaka, and then Kalpona Akter, since she was speaking at the school to many young women like you. Scott.
Well, it's positive that the Secretary raised that issue and spoke out about the plight of labor rights advocates, human rights leaders in Bangladesh, and specifically mentioned in her comments the murder of Aminul Islam. Of course, it would be better if those sentiments were actually reflected in U.S. trade policy, and if the U.S. Put genuine pressure on U.S. corporations and on overseas suppliers in places like Bangladesh in the context of U.S. trade relationships to compel greater respect for the rights of workers. Unfortunately, our trade policy does not do that.
In fact, I mean, Hillary Clinton certainly has access to the leadership of Walmart as Secretary of State, but also, you know, and someone from Arkansas, but also she was on the board of Walmart for years, wasn't she? For 6 years, Scott Nova.
Indeed, she was. And, you know, at a certain point in time, the individuals who lead these companies need to be held accountable as individuals.
Kalpona Akter, what do you feel consumers can do in the United States as we wrap up this discussion? You speaking to us as a worker activist from Dhaka, Bangladesh, where this horrific fire took place.
The consumers can play a big role because they are the most powerful player in the supply chain. They can make accountable these brands and make them bound to make change in the ground where workers are making clothes for these Western brands. This consumers group can raise their voice, and they should raise their voice and ask these factory, so as the Western brands, that they wanted to know more about the working condition of these workers who are making clothes for them, and also wanted to be sure that these workers are paying living wage, these workers are having a better life, better working condition, and safe working place. They can play a really, really vital role. And this is my urge to the U.S. consumers, that please be accountable, make responsible to your brands, and ask them to make change in the ground.
Finally, Scott Nova, your response as well. Should consumers even walk into these stores? And if so, or how should they organize, or what messages do you feel must be sent?
The best hope we have is that retailers like Wal-Mart and Gap and H&M will recognize that if they continue to operate in this manner, if they continue to pressure their suppliers on price to the point where we get these kinds of absurdly unsafe working conditions, that ultimately consumers will turn against them. And so consumers in the U.S., consumers in Europe do have the power to compel change if they choose to use it.
Thank you both for being with us. Scott Nova with the Worker Rights Consortium, and Kalpona Akter speaking to us from Dhaka, Bangladesh, part of the Bangladesh Center for Worker Solidarity, facing criminal charges in her own country for organizing to make factories safer. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. Many of the people who died in this plant, the vast majority this weekend, were women. We're going to talk about women's rights and the fight against violence against women with Eve Ensler.